Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing a special, atypical episode of the podcast. I will be interviewing my co-host, Talli, as well as Dr. David Ribner about their wonderful new book, I Am for My Beloved, a guide to enhanced intimacy for married couples. It's available on Amazon, and I cannot recommend this book enough. It's candid, honest, it's explicit, as well as respectful, and it's eye-opening, whether you're engaged, on the cusp of getting married, or have been married, happily or otherwise, for a very long time. I Am for My Beloved will definitely help your intimate relationship. So Mazal Tov in writing this book, and I really thought it was terrific.
Thank you. You do not have to be engaged to read the book. Just putting that out there.
Okay, good. So even more people should be reading this book and purchasing this book. It really is a wonderful read. Before we begin today's episode, and there is a lot to discuss, we want to thank you for listening to Intimate Judaism, and we appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. The podcast keeps gaining an ever bigger audience. With your help, we'll continue to help people all over the world begin healthy conversations about intimacy, sexuality, and Judaism. Make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh list, and more. Please continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. As I mentioned, you should definitely check out intimatejudaism.com, and I hope you'll also visit my own website, jewishcoffeehouse.com, which has lots of great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism. It was recently revamped, so in my very non-objective opinion, it's better than ever, and I hope you'll visit it. Talli, your website as well has been revamped.
Yes, I have a new website, and you are all welcome to take a look at it. I'm selling some different products on the site that are meant to enhance your marital relationships.
And that's tallirosenbaum.com with 2 L's in Talli.
Yes, and if you happen to be a professional, whether you are an educator or a therapist or work with people, individuals and couples, I urge you to take a look at some of the online webinars that can enhance your work with Jewish couples.
And before we begin the actual discussion of the book, why don't you tell us about the book launch that's coming up?
Yes, I did want to mention that David and I will be launching the book at the invitation of the Eden Center, and we will be meeting at the home of Gabby and Mickey Lavenpel, which is in Katamon. For more details, please check the Facebook page of Intimate Judaism or my personal Facebook page, my professional Facebook page, or the Eden Center's Facebook page, and you will find the information. And we look forward to seeing you there if you happen to be in Israel, in Jerusalem, on the 3rd of February. Warm up your winter with your beloved.
Let's jump in and discuss the book. Listeners to this podcast know that Talli needs no introduction. Let me tell our listeners who David Ribner is. Dr. Ribner is the founder and chairman of the Sex Therapy Training Program at Bar Ilan University. He's a certified sex therapist and supervisor in the U.S. and Israel. He is in private practice as a sex and marital therapist in Jerusalem. He's authored some 40 articles and book chapters, and he writes and lectures extensively on cultural sensitivity and sexuality. He's also the co-author with Jenny Rosenfeld of Eight La'ahov, A Time to Love, The Newlywed's Guide to Physical Intimacy, helping understand the interface between tradition and sexuality. David, thank you so much for joining us today on Intimate Judaism.
My great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
David, let me start with you. I want to ask a question about the book itself. And the opening chapters of the book discuss intimacy with broad strokes, somewhat apart from sexual intimacy per se. You discuss spiritual intimacy, intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy. Why did you choose to open a book primarily dealing with sexual intimacy with a discussion of other forms of intimacy?
One of the things that has happened over the course of our developing this book, and we began to talk about it at least, I think, 2.5 years ago, something like that, Talli, is that we began to realize that our initial more narrow focus was really not suitable for the kind of assistance we think we can bring to individuals and couples who are curious, if not struggling, with some of their own issues of human sexuality. We felt very strongly that you cannot put the physical impact and physical behaviors with regard to human sexuality in any kind of context other than an emotional context. And so we felt very strongly that that needed to be the initial footsteps of this book. And as it moved on, I think we began to expand that and realize that that was, in fact, the correct direction.
David, how different would the book be had it not been written with an observant Jewish audience in mind, or if I can put that somewhat differently, were you and Talli at all restricted in what you felt comfortable saying or suggesting in the book because of the book's primary and likely readership?
So let me answer the second question first, because I think that's a little bit more straightforward. No, we did not feel restricted at all. We tried as much as possible to be open and explicit and give the information that we think people could benefit from. Again, both an emotional as well as physical kind of relationship issues. As far as the metaphors that we use, both Talli and I come out of Orthodox Jewish backgrounds, and our work is infused with that notion in terms of how do we make sexuality something that's not just palatable, but thoroughly enjoyable for the religious community. As we moved along, Talli was able to sort of, I think, help me focus on the fact that there was more involved in that, and that a lot of the metaphors that we use are relevant to other groups as well, other religious groups, other traditional groups.
You mean outside of the Jewish community?
That is correct. And we are hoping that, in fact, other groups outside the Jewish community will become aware of the book, will make use of it. And I think we have sufficiently explained the metaphors that we use so that other people can make very common, everyday use of this book as well.
I appreciate you saying that. I also want to add this. This is a book that was intended for Orthodox married couples. So as such, we clearly, and I understand if there is legitimate criticism about this, exclude LGBT and exclude single people. And we talk about married heterosexual couples. But having said that, we're a book that's meant for Orthodox Jewish couples, and yet we talk very frankly about sex. We provide pictures of sexual positions. We talk about all sorts of issues that actually are relevant in the Orthodox community today that to some extent are swept under the rug, like pornography and infidelity and other issues that affect all areas of life as well as intimate life. So many parts of the book are universal. So for example, when we talk about life cycle changes, menopause or pregnancy and postpartum and sexuality in the face of chronic illness or chronic pain, obviously those issues are going to be universal. When we talk about the challenges of keeping the laws of Taharat HaMishpacha, which are the laws of family purity, or we talk about issues regarding obligation to satisfy one's partner or to be available for sex when one's partner wants and what the implications are for sexuality, those would be more specific to Orthodoxy, but actually some of those, as David mentioned, are not uncommon. For example, and we don't talk about this that much in this book, this is an important factor in David's previous book with Jenny, the idea of going from nothing to everything or waiting until marriage to have sex. That's something that is really not very common other than in faith-based populations.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I did notice that and thinking about a lot of those issues as relevant to our podcast. In other words, I was reading it both as an interested reader as well as the co-host of this podcast saying, oh yeah, we got to talk about that. Oh, that's a good episode. Oh, there's another episode as well. There's a lot of information there about everything, as you said, that really has to be dealt with. And it's amazing that it was not swept under the carpet in your book. I want to get into the book itself, Talli, and one line that stood out to me was, I'm quoting, "Sex is a place to be rather than something to do." Can you explain what that means?
Well, people tend to look at sex as an act. It's something that you do with a certain frequency. And even in the previous podcast when we talked about pleasure, and you brought the Mishnah of how many times a week does one have to have sex with his wife? I believe it was from Ketubot, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And I pointed out to you that you're talking about frequency and that sexuality is not just about how many times a week or how many times a couple has sex. Sex is not just something that you have or something that you do. It is part of your personal sense of self, and it is part of the relational energy. So sex doesn't just start with going into the bedroom and taking your clothes off. Sex can start with the way you look at each other in the morning in the kitchen and how you kind of relate to one another with a certain energy of intimacy, of eroticism, of passion, of playfulness, depending on the character of your relationship.
So let me follow up, because you also mentioned that a lot of the time couples see sex as goal-oriented and as something which, as you say, they want to check off their to-do list. Doesn't mean they don't enjoy it, but they look at it as something to accomplish. And you obviously are saying now that's generally not really the right way or not the best way to see sex. How does a couple avoid falling into that trap?
Well, I don't know that I would say that it's necessarily couples that see sex as something that they need to check off. What we might see is a difference in the way each partner views the meaning of sex. And for one partner, it may be something to check off, and for the other, it may be something else. And that's something that we wanted in the book. I'm not speaking now from a clinician's point of view. I'm speaking now as David's co-author. We wanted to get people to think about things like, what is the meaning of sex for you? And if the meaning of sex is about obligation, or it feels like a chore, or it feels like something that you have to check off, that's not particularly sustainable for maintaining passion and romance over the long term, which is really the goal of our message, is how to be able to do that in a long-term monogamous relationship.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that last point is truly crucial, and that is what we're emphasizing here is that notions of sex becoming just, habituated over the course of a marriage lifetime is not the way that we would like people to be able to look at their sense of intimacy. And one of the language issues that I think we're very careful with is to be able to not only use the term sex, but to use the term physical intimacy as it leads from emotional intimacy. And then, as Talli points out, you can become emotionally intimate at any point in your day, even if you're talking to each other 5,000 miles away. Having that level of emotional intimacy allows physical intimacy to become much more of a sort of naturalized kind of experience between two people. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I think the other thing we tried to introduce in this book is that human sexuality is almost limitless in its variety. And that as people move along in their lifetimes, various kinds of contact may become more meaningful, more enjoyable than they were earlier on. People's bodies change, their lives change, children change people, but none of those changes should in any way compromise the fact that people can have meaningful, intimate relationships, both physical as well as emotional.
That's very interesting, because it leads directly into something else you wrote in the book. A recurring theme that I saw in the book is how different life events and simply life itself has a strong effect on a couple's sexual desire, specifically desire. You talk about different aspects of sexuality. So I'm speaking of desire here. Some of these events can be pregnancy, menopause, chronic illness, as you just said, and more. When should a couple see decreased desire as something that needs attention and fixing, frankly? And when should they accept it as a normal part of healthy sexuality? In other words, when does a decrease in desire indicate that there's actually a problem in the relationship that needs addressing, rather than it just being part of life? How does a couple know when that is?
Well, first of all, desire will not be consistent throughout a lifespan. I mean, it will have moments and times and periods when it will be more intense and less intense. And I think we need people to realize that you don't necessarily have to worry about that. Sex before your first child and sex after your first child can be entirely different experiences. Both of them are normative, particularly with the population that we're dealing with here. Again, we're talking primarily about married couples who tend to stay together in their lifetimes and who will have children. All of those things will produce changes that are just inevitable. And the point we're making here is that, first of all, a theme that we go back to constantly is that couples need to talk with each other. They need to be in communication with each other. They need to be able to be open with each other. That kind of verbal connection is an absolute requirement before they begin to move on to anything else. If they can talk to each other and discuss where they are going at that moment, then their lives become that much more uncomplicated. When it becomes a problem is when primarily there's a divergence between two people, when they can't seem to be in the same place at the same time, or, as we point out in the book, when there are physiological issues that may begin to interfere with a couple's capacity to be physical with each other. Those are the times when they need to see a professional of some kind.
And you also mentioned that physiology is usually not the sole reason for the problems. That's something which came out as well from the book. It could be an aspect of it, but it's unlikely to be the entire problem. Is that true, Talli?
That is true. There are situations where the presenting issue is largely a physiological one, but that is likely to create certain anxieties and tensions. So we really cannot isolate psychological factors from physiological factors and from the relational dynamics. I do want to go back to your previous question, though, about when is decreased desire a problem, or when is it a problem when couples just aren't having sex or aren't having enough sex or aren't having good sex? I at no point would say either objectively or subjectively, this particular problem means you need to seek help or you need to go to a sex therapist or any other kind of therapist. I think that what drives people to therapy is distress, whether it's individual distress or relational distress. What we definitely want to be aware of, certainly as clinicians, is we don't want to impose our value system about how much sex people should be having or what kind of sex people should be having, in the same way that you as clergy might teach. That's not what we do. We appreciate and we connect with our value system in the way that we talk about sexuality. But I wouldn't say that somebody necessarily needs to treat an issue if that issue is not a cause of personal or relational distress.
Well, can you give an example of what you're speaking about?
So, for example, I can tell you about a couple who came to see me because of issues in their relationship primarily, but also issues of sexuality. And this is a couple in their 60s where he was experiencing erectile dysfunction due to a combination of some psychological factors, but also very possible physical factors due to some cardiovascular disease. And she actually was experiencing tremendous pain in her vagina from postmenopause. And also, this was a second marriage. And so she had not been sexually active for many years. And the resumption of intercourse was quite painful. There was also an issue of timing. When he would have the erection, he would want to have penetration occur at the moment that he could, whether she was kind of ready or not. And they were told by their rabbi that they should really seek sex therapy so that they could have sex, the right way. Now, it was interesting, after a course of couples therapy and working on their relationship and their intimacy, they actually got to a place of having a very nice, intimate connection where they could provide pleasure to one another, maybe not in the same way that you might think that sex should go. It was without intercourse. And maybe their frequency wasn't very high because they're an older couple and they had some medical issues and there was some tiredness and fatigue. But if this couple were to have come to me at the stage that they were already doing that, and we're wanting to have intercourse because we're focusing just on that, I'm not sure that I would have necessarily had very much to do with them other than to reassure them that what they have sounds very beautiful.
Well, that leads to the question of what actually is a real warning sign. In other words, you're describing some physiological problems that they had, which is a reason that they would seek out help because he was having difficulty maintaining an erection, she was having pain. What should a couple look for when there's no physiological problem? They're just not having sex very often, and they might be okay with it, but maybe they're really drifting apart and they need to seek out help, and they might not realize it. Is there a specific warning sign
they're
you look
seeking
for?
out help. And the fact that they're seeking out help means that they have some amount of distress. My point earlier was that it is not up to outsiders to decide what's distressful for a certain couple, even if they don't have sex or if they have sex extremely infrequently. If that's what they both agree to. It's kind of the same thing as if you have two people who are into kink and doing all kinds of things that you and I may not necessarily connect with, but they are both consenting adults and this is what they both agree to do. So I'm certainly not going to say, oh, you should really treat that problem that you have with wanting to do kink, or I wouldn't even necessarily consider it to be a problem. It's just a orientation. David, did you want to add
I think
anything
one of
to
the things
that?
that we try to emphasize in the book is that the subjective pleasure of both people engaged in this is the most important thing. There are no really objective criteria with regard to how frequently or exactly what people are supposed to be doing. If a couple is having sex once a month and that's great for them, then we certainly have no say in anything with regard to that. And I think many people are the victims of the public media who will publish articles saying that if you're within a certain age group, you need to have intercourse X number of times per week, otherwise there's something the matter with you. And one of the most amazing things about human sexuality is its incredibly wide options and varieties of actions that people can do with each other. And again, the only criteria is this is something that is mutually agreeable and brings them the kind of satisfaction they're looking for. It's when they don't have that level of satisfaction, it's when they do feel that there is something that they'd like to get to where they're not now, that they might engage the attention of a sexual health professional. But we would certainly not in any way, and we don't say in the book, make any standards with regard to what we think normative or sex is supposed to look like.
So that means in the book, where you do indeed spend a significant amount of time and space discussing alternate positions and sex aids or sex toys and various other non-missionary position types of sexual intercourse and sexual activity. So it's not that you necessarily recommend that. You're saying that's there and you're explaining things that are available for couples who are looking for it. But if a couple's not interested, you're not necessarily advocating they try it. Is that correct?
Well, one of the points that we found is sort of critical with regard to guiding us in this book is where else are they going to get this information that's comfortable for them? This is what we wrote this book all about, because we don't want them necessarily trying to look on the internet and looking up sexual positions and then finding things that are going to make them just uncomfortable. And again, we lead them into this by first looking at their relationships outside of their bedroom before we look at what's going on with them in terms of their actual physical sexual life. Now, we know that this book is not going to be read as a novel, right? People are not necessarily going to pick it up and read it from the beginning to the end. But we at least want to provide that spectrum of options for them that allows them to see that if you do want to add something, if you do want to make some change, if you do want to find out if there is some other way to engage in the kind of physical connection that you're looking for, we want to provide that for you.
Yeah, that's great. And I also want to add to that what you were saying, David, about the media. When you do go to sources like magazines, people can read what they want. We didn't write this book to prevent people from Googling things, but I think that it does provide an opportunity to normalize people's sexuality. When you do go to these media, often you'll read about how you're not really having a good orgasm unless you have a squirting orgasm or unless you have a G-spot orgasm or unless no matter how much you think that you're okay, the media will make you think that you're missing out on something and you should be having a stronger, longer, harder, better sex life than you are having. So we really wanted to provide something that would allow people to feel secure that if they are liking what they're doing and they, that there are ways to enhance it if they want to make it better, but they shouldn't feel like they're necessarily missing out. On the other side of the coin, we also did want to acknowledge that, look, as Orthodox Jews, we grow up a certain way. And the way that we grow up is that we try to be really good at things. And I think that this is true religiously, but it's also true culturally. We are achievers. We're academic. We want to do our best at things. And I think that when it comes to sex, it's not different than other areas of life where people are really anxious. Are we doing it enough? And am I a good enough husband? Am I a good enough wife? My Rav told me that I have to make sure that my wife has pleasure. So now this guy is going to experience a great deal of anxiety about his performance. Another part of that is the women who feel that their job is to provide sex for their husbands who have no other means of sexual release. Many of them have received messages that if they don't provide at the rate of need that the husband wants, then the husband could possibly spill seed, and that would be problematic.
And we've talked about that in earlier
And we've talked about
episodes,
that a
right?
lot. So the idea here is that we're providing a different message. The idea of sex in order to prevent spilled seed is not a sustainable message. Sex is a place of connection, of pleasure, of containment, of holding, of enjoying. There's so much to it. And the book was really intended to help couples reframe from those messages into something much more deeply meaningful.
Yeah, I found that very interesting how you mentioned in the book, as you mentioned now, that often, for example, a yeshiva bacher will be used to being at the top of his class and being able to finish however many masechtot of Gemara. And then on the wedding night, he looks at it also as something to be done, something which he has to succeed at, which can cause an undue level of anxiety beyond the natural anxiety a person might have. But I want to take something which both of you just mentioned about communication. I'm going to quote something which you wrote in the book. And you said, establish a policy that each of you can suggest any sexual activity, and by the same token, each of you can safely say no. You talked about how a couple, if they feel that they are missing something and they want to try different positions or sex toys, this is something which they can feel comfortable doing. But what would you recommend in a situation where there actually is communication and one member of the couple really wants to try something and the other member really doesn't? And you might say, well, obviously the no wins out. And that's obviously true if it's something which the other one finds uncomfortable. But maybe the person who wants to do it is going to be extremely disappointed or frustrated. What does someone do there where the communication isn't the problem? It's what comes after the communication when they're not on the same page.
First of all, you're asking a question which I think is pretty common. I think often one partner might want to try something and the other partner might be hesitant or might say no. And there are a lot of different reasons for the no. You might be married to somebody who, if you offered them a different restaurant on a different night of the week, they're going to say, what do you mean no? Of course not. We always eat at this restaurant and always on a Tuesday night. So a lot of the no might come from factors that are not so much about the sexual activity itself, but about personality, about anxiety or other traits that the person might have. One thing that I always do with couples when this comes up is that I think more than anything else, the person who wants to try the activity, it's important to want to stay curious and understand what is it for you. I had a couple where one partner really wanted to try all sorts of different things, and this person had a great deal of need to be unrestrained, to be free. That's really what it was about. And the other partner in the marriage was always bringing them down and grounding them and saying this no and that no and this no. And that was kind of like the dynamic. It's true that that partner did need a great deal of safety. And there was no way that I could suggest that she try things she did not want to try because that would have sabotaged her safety. She had had trauma in her life. So what really needed to happen was that she needed to stop saying no and just listen to why. Sometimes just being curious and being interested in understanding the other person without pathologizing them, without saying, that's sick, you're disgusting, why would you want to do those perverted things? But saying, wow, I'm hearing that you really would like to try this and this. I get now why you would want to try it. And sometimes that just makes the partner feel almost as good as if they would have gone and tried it. The other thing I want to say, and I really want to hear David's take on this too, is that for everything we do, there are certain red lines. And I think that, sometimes we have a zone, and the zone is, sure, I'll try anything once. And then there's a zone of, yes, definitely. There's a zone of, okay, I'll try. And then there's a zone of, no way am I ever going to try that. And I think we have to know where we fall into that zone. And if we can kind of be in that nuanced gray space of, all right, I'm willing to try with an open mind. I can try it once and I can always say no. And if I don't like it, if it's uncomfortable, if it makes me feel awkward, that's why the communication part is so important.
Let me answer also from, I think, one specific section of the book. One of the problems that I think people sometimes have is that they feel that there's only yes and there's only no. And there's really never any attempt to find something that works somewhere between those two polar opposites. When we started writing the section of the book about oral sex, What we really needed to do was give people options about if they wanted to try some of it in some way, they could do so without going to some place that may make them feel entirely uncomfortable. And I think that ends up being sort of a metaphor for many other aspects of trying different kinds of things in the realm of human sexuality. It doesn't have to be just yes or no. It can be someplace in the middle of those two things. And the other thing I just want to say is I know that we tend to use gender metaphors with regard to this. That's usually the men who are wanting to try all kinds of things and the women who are saying, no, I think I would like to disabuse people of that. It's not necessarily related to one's gender in terms of what one wants to do or not. There are sufficient numbers of people on both sides of the gender aisle who may be more inclined to try new things and others who are going to say, no, I really don't want to go there at all, whether it's for personal or whether it's for cultural reasons. So, I think we need to be really careful here that this is not going to be stuck someplace and that all men are all women, which is one of the myths that we try to do away with in the context of the book.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that we're seeing more and more situations where the female partner wants more, or there's a desire discrepancy where the male partner has less interest or less desire. In terms of trying things, I can tell you that many more women, especially in the more right-wing populations, complain about certain things like the lights being off. They don't like that, or the kind of secrecy or hiddenness or darkness. That's just been a common complaint. Things having to do with halachic restrictions that seem to inhibit them. That seems to come up.
Scott, there's a sociological phenomenon that's happening here also, is that women are feeling, in general, much more liberated in terms of overall society. That certainly seeps into the religious society as well. And women who before may have only seen themselves as providing sexual satisfaction for their husbands now are becoming much more aware of their own potential for sexual satisfaction. Sometimes they will come into a marriage with significantly more information about their own sexuality than men will come in to about the male sexuality. And I think that is one of the things that needs to somehow be worked out between the two of these people. In general, I think there has been a very positive movement with regard to some greater equality in terms of each member of the couple trying to provide the kind of sexual satisfaction that the partner will be able to wake up in the morning with a smile on his or her face.
And certainly on this podcast, we've quoted your article, Talli, I Am His Vessel, numerous times to deal with this exact problem where people, often women, just assume certain ideas about their responsibility to their husband without necessarily looking at their own pleasure as something which is a value.
Yeah, but I also think that our point here is that we also have been trying to emphasize that it hasn't been a piece of cake for men either. And just like in the general society, there is a lot of discussion about toxic masculinity and the messages that men receive about having to be so strong and not being able to express their emotions. We here as well are looking at the vulnerability of men who are often put in a position where they are expected to be in charge or to not be able to talk about what they feel. And we want to have a lot of sensitivity for men and women.
Well, then speaking of sensitivity, that moves me in a different direction. You have a chapter in the book that advocates mindfulness as part of sexual activity. What do you mean by that? What is mindfulness when it comes to sex?
So David and I were not on the same page originally with the mindfulness. Yep. I think that, David, you connected it with hippies on the beach and bare feet and all that. And I have to admit, I'm not exactly out there going to India every year and doing Vipassana or what are those things where you don't speak for, I don't think I could last 10 minutes without speaking. But I like the idea of mindfulness because it connects you with your senses. And
what does it mean, though?
I would say, to put it in Orthodox Jewish terms, it's like having kavana. It's like when you pray to God and you really concentrate and you feel your feelings and you feel what's going on in your body and you think about the prayer and you feel the connection with God. It's about intent. And mindfulness really is about getting out of your head and being in the moment, not being in your thoughts about what's going to happen if or what comes ahead, but rather this feels really nice now and this is where I'm feeling it. And it can be okay for not nice feelings as well. So if you have anxiety, or a lot of people will feel anxiety, and then they'll get more anxious about the anxiety. So mindfulness will allow you to say, okay, I'm having these uncomfortable feelings, but I know what they are and they're going to pass. So mindfulness, in the sense that we used it, we kind of compared it to how our tradition values sensation. We talked about this on our pleasure podcast when we talked about Shabbat and the table being all set,
right,
and Havdalah and the smelling of the cloves. And so I think that what we wanted to do was bring this in to the sexual setting and put the emphasis not on what's going to be, not on performance and not on goals and not on orgasms and erections, but rather just be, just enjoy, just.
And that certainly relates back to
moment.
the idea of sex as a place to be rather than as something
Yeah.
which you have to accomplish.
Yeah.
David, do you feel the same way, or do you have a different approach towards this?
We should have written that chapter with the phrase underneath, "This is Talli's chapter."
Do you not agree
I would like
with
to
it,
say
or-
the same thing about David when it comes to the chapter on sexual enhancements and positions, by the way.
Do you disagree with that way of looking at it, or
Look,
is
I
it
don't
just...
disagree. It's a language that I'm not necessarily all that comfortable with, and being a lot older than either of you, I think those are notions that sort of resurface every 20 or 30 years with different kinds of language that describe them. So I'm not opposed to it. I just don't think that, we need to necessarily look to the Far East for the kinds of understanding that I think do help when people need to not be so performance oriented and just be much more, there with each other. I don't necessarily disagree with the fundamental notions of it, but the language of it is not mine.
So we're almost out of time. I want to ask another question about the final part of the book. The last section of the book is called Passionate Monogamy. You quote Esther Perel, the author of Mating in Captivity, as well as another book called The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity. And she says that too much intimacy in a marriage contributes to affairs. If I understood her correctly, she essentially is suggesting that intense intimacy decreases passion because, and I'm quoting her, how can you desire what you already know you have? So you both make it clear that you disagree with her perspective, but I want to know why. Like, obviously, as religious Jews, this is not how we think, but where, in your opinion, is she mistaken?
Okay, so first of all, I'm glad that you understood it that way, because we really looked very hard on the language of those first couple paragraphs to make sure that that was clear, that we're quoting her as someone who is well-respected and well-known, but we feel that she's really off the mark with regard to this. And our whole notion in terms of writing this book is that it's certainly possible to maintain emotional and physical intimacy ad mea ve'esrim shana, and that it may be different and it may require rewriting one's intimate contract. It may require different levels of communication, but it is so worth the effort that to not do that would really be a significant loss of a great potential that people might have.
Yeah, so I would like to add to that. We did quote Esther Perel, who I respect a lot. I like her a lot, and she has informed much of the way I work with infidelity. The idea of how can you have passion or how can you sustain passion when there is so much intimacy is not solely her idea. There are two schools of thought around this in the couples therapy and sex therapy world. There's the emotionally focused therapy people who sound more like we do around the idea of when you have real intimacy, you have safety and you have security, and that's what you need in order to be able to allow yourself to be so vulnerable and to let yourself go. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that for some couples, they do require something more than that type of intimacy. And there are some approaches that don't necessarily think that too much intimacy is a good thing. And I do think that we want to be able to create some amount of mystery and some amount of boundaries, because you don't want to be so enmeshed with your partner that you really do know what they're thinking and that you have no boundaries between you. What I've heard before is that, and I believe it was Martin Buber who says this, the intimacy occurs in the space between you, and being able to maintain some space between you, some what we call in the language of therapy differentiation, is really important. And so we are balancing that. We're saying on the one hand, look, whether you like it or not, we're in a monogamous relationship because those are our values. So yeah, I'm sure couples with different values or who have just more fluidity in terms of trying out other things, maybe they will find some ways to feel better or more erotic. I think there are pitfalls in those ways of being, whether it's polyamory or others or swinging, but I don't want to say that they're necessarily wrong. I don't know enough, but that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant for the population that we are in and for whom we wrote the book.
Many years ago, I happened to read a number of hespedim that Gedolei Hador had said when their wives had passed away, okay? And I was just knocked over by the expression of passion that they had in those hespedim that they never would have said when their wives were alive in a public forum. I think that's sort of like a classic example of two people who really were able to maintain that kind of intense level of passion. I have no idea what they were doing in their bedroom, but there was certainly a very significant level of intensity that would be an example to, I think, all of us.
In fact, at the very end of the book, you quote a couple of Hasidic masters who talk about the importance of passion and pleasure as a primary Jewish value, and that certainly comes out through the book. There's so much more to talk about this book. Once again, I cannot recommend it enough to our listeners. I say this not only because Talli is my friend and my co-host, but because it really is a phenomenal book. So David and Talli, thank you both so much for being here and for writing this book, which I hope and I really expect will be a primary resource for singles and married couples for a long, long time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will just say, Scott, it was a pleasure writing this with Talli, and I think that I look forward to more opportunities for us to work together.
Thanks, David.
Thank you all for listening to Intimate Judaism. If you're interested in purchasing the book, once again, it's called I Am for My Beloved, A Guide to Enhance Intimacy for Married Couples by Dr. David Ribner and Talli Rosenbaum. It's available on Amazon and in many bookstores, Jewish and otherwise. It's also available directly from the publisher. It's Orem Publications. We will have a link to buy it on the Intimate Judaism website, as well as on Talli Rosenbaum's website. So, Talli, I'm looking forward to our next episode. We can get back to our normal misgeret, our normal framework of co-hosting it. This time, though, it was a very nice experience to go back to our original episode, which we had about a year and a half ago, where I was interviewing you. Next time, we'll go back to our normal style. But thank you all for joining us. Please send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. For show notes from this show, as well as all of our podcasts, a full podcast archive, a free men's mikvah list, and more, go to intimatejudaism.com. Go to tallirosenbaum.com and sign up for her newsletter. Please go to jewishcoffeehouse.com and you can read my blog along with lots of other great podcasts. With Talli Rosenbaum, I'm Scott Kahn. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Bye.